Better? All righty. Do I start over and tell the jokes again? No, we won't start over. No. My wife and I used to do a marriage encounter. And one of the things that we always did in every session is we had to tell some jokes. But I'm going to save you that. Because they were really not very good jokes. They were worse than dad jokes. So let's talk about emotions. We're going to talk about, and what I've kind of done is I've kind of divided up the emotions today and tomorrow between those emotions that are just those gut reactions, those instantaneous emotions. And tomorrow we're going to look at some emotions that are more complex because they kind of stick with us a little bit longer. So how do we deal with those two? And how do we deal with certain emotions that are just quick response emotions? And tomorrow we're going to look at how do we deal with emotions that linger with us. Okay? So come back tomorrow if you want to figure out how to deal with some of those. And today, right now, we're going to look at a few emotions. Before we get started, though, let me just bring this up. Remember, this session, we're going to talk about these quick response mechanisms, quick response emotions. I want you to be able to learn to identify some basic emotions, because as we talked about, the basic emotions are the ones that form all the emotions. Okay? If you have watched Inside Out, it's an incredible story, and you get to see kind of what goes on in the brain. Okay? It's a story, but it does a pretty good job explaining to us a little bit about the different emotions. Okay? They start off with 4, and then the older she gets, it turns into 8. Okay? And what controls those. So it's a really good, but it's basically that. You've got your basic emotions, both positive and negative. Okay? And right now we're going to look at some more of the negative ones. Because I don't think we have a whole lot of trouble dealing with joy or happiness or or pleasantries. But when we get into the little more negative, we run into a little more challenges sometimes. Okay? So here's 2 things to remember. Remember that when we talk about emotions, our brain is doing a natural comparison in our brain. And we really don't have any control over it. I say that. We don't have any control over what happens, but we can work on changing that. Okay? So your brain is going to compare what it perceives about who you are. Okay? Basically your identity. And it's going to compare it to whatever it's perceiving from the stimuli coming into your brain. Okay? Is this a threat or is this not a threat? Okay? Is this a challenge to me or is it not a challenge to me? And so when it makes that comparison, it's going to produce that emotional response. Right? If it deems it to be a threat, it's going to kick in its fight or flight or freeze mechanism. Okay? And if it deems it as something that's good, it's going to kick it into the joy or the more comfortable emotions that we run into. Okay? It's going to do that instantaneously. Just to give you a quick idea, here's some of those core emotions. And I'm not going to dwell on these much because we're going to go through most of these. Okay? So like anger. Anger, your body perceives an injustice happening. Okay? Fear is a lack of security. Sadness is a loss of something. Hurt is there's an injury. Okay? Loneliness, you feel disconnected. Okay? Guilt, something's wrong. Shame, something is made you a bad person. Okay? And we'll go into all of these. And then there's some good emotions there that glad, when you feel glad about certain things. So when that comparison is made, we see these 2 things coming into play. Produces that basic emotion. Now, remember, combined with all of the other things that are going on in us, there may be a difference between hostility and frustration because it combines with other things. Now, one of the ways it combines with other things, which is the second part I want you to understand, is that emotions and how intense these emotions are depend on how close they are to you. Okay? When we go back to the exercise, we ran into this exercise about the taking things away. If you lost your pets, that's not as big of an issue as losing your spouse. Why is that? Because your spouse is someone very connected to you, very part of who you are. Okay? Your pets, yeah, you like them, but they don't compare I take that back. Some people do. I take that back. Okay? In my life, my pets do not compare to my spouse. Okay? If I lose my car keys, well, that's pretty painful, but it's not the same as losing my son. See how that works? Because that's what's closer to me. So it produces a different remark. If someone says something about you as a person or you as a preacher, that may hurt more than if they say something about you as a Texan. No, probably not. Okay? So the intensity comes with how close those are to your heart and how close they are tied to your identity. Okay? And that's where we need to understand that sometimes these emotions, for me, may be stronger than they are for my spouse, even though it's the same thing we lost. Give you an example. When we moved back, or when we got ready to move back from the mission field, my wife went through about 4 or 5 months of wrestling with her identity because all she ever wanted to do in her life was to be a missionary. Okay? So she wanted to be a missionary, and she'd grown up wanting to be a missionary. She wanted to raise her kids on the mission field, and that's where she wanted to live her life. Even though we knew it was for a better reason to be back with my parents who needed some more care, she really struggled with that identity. And it was very painful for her to leave. Okay? But for me, in my mind, yes, being a missionary was important, but there was no way it was going to trump the need my parents had. So for me, that wasn't quite as big a deal. But for her, missionary was a big deal. Okay? My kids just a few months ago, we did something, and they still see they see themselves as Chilean. Okay? They look just like me, but they're as Latin as any Latin I've ever met. And so when something was happening in Chile, something was going on in Chile, it was devastating to them. Okay? Because of what that closeness was to them. Okay? So depending on how close it is, we'll actually make it that way. So what Sean Webb is a guy who wrote a book. His book is called Mind Hacking Happiness. Okay? How do we learn to be happy? And a lot of this stuff comes from some of his stuff, and he talks about emotional intelligence. Talks about living our emotions. If you want to read, it's a good book. Caveat, he uses some language in it that's probably not healthy. But he's getting his point across. Okay? But good book. He says the severity of the emotions emotion you experience is determined by the importance of that expectation or that preference of yours. Okay? And that's where it comes to the intensity and the depth of that. Okay? So that's important. So, here we go. You ready? So 2 things to remember. Your body makes a comparison, and the intensity of that emotion, it depends on how big or how important that perception or that identity is for you. Okay? Meet my little friend. Anger. Anger is a very strong emotion. Okay? But let me ask you, is anger wrong? Is it wrong to be angry? No? Why would you say it's not wrong to be angry? Jesus showed anger. As we mentioned this morning, God burned in anger against the Israelites.
Just an hour or so, you said don't say that.
Don't say, I just said don't say that anger's wrong. Okay? Thanks for listening. I appreciate that. None of you caught that, but he did. Man, I'll take you to lunch tomorrow. No, just kidding. But that's true. So when we think about anger, but how many of us have this negative impression that anger is something wrong? That we should be angry? Why? We were taught all our lives, don't be angry. Okay? We were taught all our lives that anger is a negative emotion, that you should not feel anger. But what we've learned is that anger comes whether we want to or not. Okay? So here's how a couple of different people define anger. Anger is an expression or an event that we sense when something is unfair or unjust. Okay? Brings about a feeling that the unjust or the unfair action must be handled. Right? So unfairness, okay, should produce an emotion of anger. When Jesus gets angry in the temple, what unjustness is going on? Or what is unfair going on there? They're making his father's house a den of thieves. Okay? They had taken what was holy, and they turned it into a marketplace. Now, what's interesting is God allowed for them to do that if they had the right attitude. But he saw that was different. Okay, so he saw that something was unfair. And so he proceeded to fix that. When God gets angry with the Israelites, what's the unjustness? He has just brought them out of Egypt. He's provided for them. And what do? They turn towards him and they do the high-handed, we don't care about you. That's unfair. That's unjust. Okay? So we see that that's the emotion. So when we think about anger, and Sean Webb describes it this way, not just an injustice is being done, but anger is the reaction that occurs when your mind perceives an attack on you. Now, he goes on to describe that as sometimes we feel unjustly accused, unjustly done something towards us, and so it's still the unjustness, but who's it focused at? Me. So when we feel anger, it is a natural response. When someone is taken advantage of, how or what, for the most part, is the reaction to that? It's anger. It's a good emotion. It is a good emotion. And if we go to James chapter 4, if anybody's got their Bible, I appreciate you pulling it up. In James chapter 4, he talks about anger. Okay? And he gives them the reason why they get angry. Okay? Does anybody have it? Read it for us.
What causes fights and quarrels among you? But they come from your desires that battle within you. You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasure.
Okay? So what's James saying? Why do we get angry? Because we pitch fit, because we don't get what we want. Okay? We don't get what we want. A little bit different, but it's still an angry emotion. So when we deal with anger, there's two kinds of ways to deal with anger. There's explosive anger. Okay? Many of you ever experienced somebody else's explosive anger? Okay? They blow up, they get irate, their blood boils, and they get angry. But also there's an anger that's internalized. You ever heard of passive aggressiveness? They make you know that they're angry, but they don't say a word to you. Okay? So anger has two sides in that process. But here's what this counselor says. Anger is a problem for every Christian. Okay? A sinful anger is probably involves 90% of the cases that he deals with in his counseling. Okay? Now, when he's talking about a sinful anger, he's not talking about the emotional anger. He's talking about the action of anger. Okay? Jesus was angry and didn't sin. But we get angry, and typically our follow-up is to be sinful. All right? So when we look at that, so how do we learn to do that in that process? Okay? So how do we learn to deal with this injustice? How do we learn to deal with this emotion in us that creates this anger in us? Because we want to be people or godly people that learn to deal with anger the way Jesus dealt with anger. How do we do that? Well, first off, we go back to Cain. We go back to Cain. And we talk about, well, Cain, why are you angry? God asked him. You think about something that was mentioned in Bible class this morning about Jonah. When Jonah's angry and Jonah's frustrated, what does God ask him? Why are you angry? So in our process of learning to deal with our anger, and so the challenge becomes is these processes that we're going to go through today in dealing with these different emotions it may seem very tedious, okay? It may seem very challenging, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. Any of you drive a manual transmission? Few of you? Do you remember learning to drive a manual transmission? How difficult was that? I get the clutch in there and get it shifted gears just right, and you stall it on the hill. Why? Because you're doing all this process of trying to figure out how to make that work. Okay? But if you learn to drive, now you get in, you put it in gear, and you go. It's the same thing with learning to deal with our emotions. In the initial stages of learning to deal with our emotions, when we feel anger coming on, and sadness and all the others, first off, we have to learn to figure out, okay, what's going on? What's causing this in our life? What's causing this feeling? Now, we know if anger is a feeling of unjustness, a question to ask yourself is, what is the injustice that's taking place? If you're getting angry and you're getting frustrated and you're trying to figure out what's going on, ask yourself, what's the attack? What's the injustice? Right? If it's the person driving really slow in front of me who's not letting me go by, what's the anger issue that I'm developing? Because I want to go faster. I want to get there sooner. Well, once you learn to analyze that and figure that out, it's easier to deal with it. But until you learn to ask yourself that question, it keeps building and keeps building. The second thing we need to learn to do is to learn to take control of our anger. Ephesians 4:26 and 27 says this: in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Okay? Basically, he's telling us to grab hold of your anger and you be the dominant one over your anger. If the text, the biblical text says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, what is he saying about your ability to take care of that anger? Hopefully, something happens in the morning and you have at least a few hours to deal with it. What happens if it has 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon? What is he saying about your ability to control your anger? What did he tell Cain? You dominate your anger. You take control of it. You make it something that is under your possession. You make it something that you have control over, and that's what he's telling the Ephesians. He says, when you're angry, or when you get angry, because you're going to be angry, he says, you take control of it, and you don't let it go beyond the sunset. Are we able to do that? How much better would our lives be if we truly believed that we could control our anger? We can control our anger. And you can go on and read the Proverbs, because the Proverbs says over and over talk about anger. A man with a quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devises hatred. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding. So basically, he's saying the second step of learning about anger and dealing with your anger is, first, you figure out what it's from. If it's an injustice, or if it's something going on that's unjust, truly act upon it. But if it's something that I'm just feeling that they're attacking me in an unjust way, why is that? But who has to take control of the anger? Do we leave it out there for others, or do we take it on ourselves? So we learn to take it on ourselves. Okay? And I think the third thing that he tells us is that in anger, the third way we learn to deal with anger is we recognize and acknowledge the sovereignty of God. Romans 12, verse 17 through 19 says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live in peace with everyone. Do not, he says, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God and his wrath. So when we're struggling to overcome anger, you feel that anger welling up in you, you feel what's going on, and you've evaluated trying to figure out where it comes from, and you take control of it, he says, don't act on it, let who fix it? God. Let God fix it. So when you're dealing with anger, who's the one who's going to pay for what the injustice has been done? Should be God. Should be God. Now, I go back. These are struggles that we have. These are challenges that we have in our daily walk in this process. But leave room for God to handle anger. Leave room for God to be the one that fights for the unjust in your life. But one of our challenges is when I feel hurt and I have this anger and I have this issue in my life, I want to make sure that you get punished. And I want to punish that person, and I want to punish that person because they did me wrong. God says, I got you. I will take care of it, but you've got to give it to me. Let me take care of it, which is the fourth point. We have to learn to deal intentionally with anger. So when we're learning about anger, we're dealing with anger, and we're struggling with anger, we have to realize, how do you deal with it intentionally? Sometimes you release it. Sometimes you tune it out. Sometimes you zip it. You know, when you're angry and you want to yell out at somebody, sometimes you just got to zip it. Sometimes you speak about it. Sometimes you ponder it. So he's asking us as we deal with anger, the issue of anger, the emotion of anger, if we don't want it to go sinful, then go back and do those four things. Figure out why you're angry. Okay? Take control of your anger. Give it to God and deal with it in your life the way it's supposed to be dealt with. Okay? The more you do that, the more you do those four steps, the quicker and the less you have to think about it in that. Okay? Now, one of our challenges is sometimes those things of anger and other emotions become so part of who we are, we have already reacted or acted before we ever knew what was going on. Right? Sometimes it becomes part of our identity to be angry. So if I let go of my anger, who am I? So how do we deal with anger? Figure out why you're angry. Take control of it. Give it to God. And figure out how you're going to deal with it today. Okay? Now, I'm not saying, even though that's what Paul says, if you go from one day to the next without dealing with your anger, you're going to hell. But he says, don't do that. He says, you have the power to make a different choice. So if I'm angry with my spouse, or I'm angry with my leaders in the church, or I'm angry with the guy who's in front of me, or I'm angry with my children, I have the ability to make a different choice. Sometimes I just don't know how. And that's where practice is going to lead. Okay? Questions? The next emotion we're going to deal with. Yes?
I was just going to share back on the thing you talked about except for anger. It seems like our culture, that would man, because that one feels strong. I know I personally have experienced this where I would see anger come up, certain things would trigger that. And your first point there about digging or why, for me, I had to figure out there were actually some other emotions there.
Mm-hmm.
Sadness, that I had to really learn how I did my access. It's coming out as anger, probably because I felt like that was okay for a man to be angry.
Very true. Mm-hmm. Okay. That great point about sometimes it comes out as anger, but anger masks a true emotion. That's why you got to figure out why you're angry. If you can't find the unjustness, or you can't find the attack, maybe there's something else going on underneath the surface. I'll give you a quick example. My boys, 17 and 15, both driving. One day they were going to go to work together, and they decided to take my pickup. We live about 7 miles from where they work, so it's not real far, but it's far enough. They came home one night, and as they both come in the door, they said, "Dad, what does it mean for that light on the dash that says brake to be on?" I lit into them because I told them that they shouldn't be driving. They didn't know what they were doing. all but call them stupid because they should have known better than to drive with the emergency brake on. They both went through driver's ed. They'd both been driving, okay? But the more I thought about that, the more I let into them, I realized, wait a minute. What's the unjustness there? They made a mistake. They did something stupid. So what's the unjust thing there? I'm like, I couldn't find it. I couldn't find the unjustness in it. So then I'm again, okay, then what am I worried about? What's the underlying emotion coming from? And I realized it was about fear. I was afraid I was going to have to pull out of my pocket to pay for their mistake. And I didn't have any money. And to put new brakes on a pickup, a 3/4 ton pickup, is not cheap. So I was appearing to be angry, but in reality, my emotion was fear. Okay? When I was able to wrestle with that, I was able to apologize to them for my action and explain to them what I was truly feeling, because I was afraid to have to pay for it. Both my boys almost instantaneously said, well, Dad, if we messed it up, we'll pay for it. We have jobs. You know what happened to the emotion? It was gone. Because my fear was to leave because they were going to do what they needed to do to pay for it. But the anger was gone because I realized it was fear, not anger. That's how it works. Now, when we don't know how to do that, it takes us some time sometimes, and we've really let into them because we didn't figure out what was going on. Okay? So identify what it is. Because a lot of times your anger is not really anger. It's something else. Great point. The second emotion that's an immediate emotion is fear and worry. Fear is an emotion defined as anything you feel that is a threat to you. Right? If you feel there is a threat to you, then you feel fear. Okay? Have any of you ever been bitten by a dog? Okay? I was bitten many years ago, and for a number of months after being bitten by this dog, to walk near a large dog created fear, because I just experienced that. Okay? My son was mauled pretty heavily by a dog, and so for years he didn't want anything to do with dogs because they created fear in him, because it was an attack on himself. He didn't know if he would survive those things. I had to work with him to get through that, but yes, it's a threat. So in that process, whenever there's a threat to self, our body responds in fear. Now, that could be a threat in personal matters. That could be a threat in faith matters. That could be a threat in relationships. So whenever there's a threat towards me and my relationships and my things that could harm me, the natural God-given response is fear. Because he created us to respond that way to protect ourselves. Okay? So when my wife and I are struggling with something in our marriage, it produces sometimes a little bit of fear, until I can go back and remember that she said she's not going to leave me no matter what. Okay? So that alleviates the fear. But sometimes that is real. So when we deal with that, if there's a real threat to us that causes us harm, there is a true need for fear, because we were never afraid of anything. What would we do? You look at guys who climb rock climb and climb mountains, and they have no fear. You look at guys who ride motorcycles and they have no fear. That's not always a good thing. Okay? Adrenaline junkies don't have a whole lot of fear, or they've learned to overcome fear. Okay? The second one thing, though, is that worry is different than fear. Fear is a perceived actual threat. Okay? Worry or anxiety is the perception that something might go wrong instead of an actual threat. Okay? So what we run into in these processes, as people learn to do that how do you deal with that? Well, an anxiety might be, well, what if it rains? What if I'm late? What if I'm sick? What if there's not enough money? What if I make the wrong decision? And that list goes on and on and on. It's all the what ifs. It's all the what ifs and what could happen. Okay? Fear says this will happen. Anxiety and worry become to be about the what ifs it could happen. Okay? Now, I know that there are a lot of people who truly struggle with anxiety disorder. Okay? There are some anxiety disorders and worry disorders that have been created because they dealt with this for so long. But I talked to a good friend of mine who's a psychologist, and he said 90%, say 80%, so I won't go all the way to that. 80% or so of anxiety disorders, had we taught our children to overcome their fears and overcome their worries, they would have never gotten there. Okay? But what we do sometimes with our children is they say, well, I'm afraid to go to school. That's okay, you can be at home. I'm afraid to go do this. Well, that's okay, you don't have to do that. And so what have we created in our lives is fear creates a change in me, therefore I get afraid to go do anything else, and then I can't even go to work. Or I can't even go do this, or I can't even do that. And so in that process, we've taken something that's an emotion and created it into an actual illness. Okay? Now, don't hear me say that all anxiety is that way, but there are some anxiety disorders that come from the brain processing and the way it works. But most of them, most of our kids and most of our adults, in his opinion, are because we've created anxiety and fear that we never dealt with. Okay? So we deal with that. So how do we learn to deal with that? Or what's going on? Well, in that process, we know that the Lord is my shepherd. David went out to the field, dealt with the sheep, knowing that there were bears and lions, but he dealt with it because the Lord was a shepherd. Matthew 14, in the storm, there was fear, anxiety in the storm. They thought they were going to die. And Jesus says he handles it for them. Okay? Mary and Martha, when they're working, they're trying to do certain things. There's fear and anxiety when Martha asks, well, Jesus, why didn't Mary get up and help me in that? But here's the solution. God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. So how do we take an emotion that's coming to us and creating this fear and this anxiety and this difficulty in our life, and how do we turn it into the emotion that God wants, which is power through love and through control, self-control? How do we make that switch? Here's 5 steps. Now, all of this information, I can give it to Adam, and he can pass it out to you later if you want to go back and look at it later. First off, when you're dealing with the emotion of fear and we're dealing with the emotion of anxiety, first identify what the worry is or what the fear is. Okay? Figure out what it is. What's causing that emotion? What's driving that emotion? What am I truly afraid of? Is this a real fear or is this a perceived threat or perceived fear? Okay? And as you learn to figure that out, when certain things happen, here's a good example. I grew up in Colombia. Okay? Colombia was one of the most dangerous places in all the world in the 80s. Okay? If you've ever read anything about the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar, that was my heyday in Colombia. Okay? About 3 days after we arrived, we're standing in front of the hotel, and a man comes by and grabs my younger brother and takes off with him. Because kidnapping was a big thing. Praise God, my dad was still a young man, and he was in good shape, and he caught him at the corner. Okay? I went with my family to Colombia in 2011. I'm grown. It's been 15 years since I was in Colombia. And we walked off the plane, and I grabbed my kids and went like this. Okay? And my kids were like, what in the world is wrong with Dad? Because in Chile, they could go across the street and play in the park, and they could go around the corner to the store because there wasn't that fear. But when I stepped back into, as I mentioned, that book called The Body Keeps Score, when I stepped back into the environment that I knew was dangerous, had to pull them in. Okay? Was that a real threat? That was probably more worry because I hadn't had any perceived threat at that moment. Okay? So you learn to identify what it is. The second thing you have to learn to do when you're dealing with fear and anxiety is learn to recall the times that God has rescued you from those moments. That's what David did. He remembered back when God had helped him defeat the lion. He remembered back when God had helped him defeat the bear. He went back and relied on God in that process. He prayed for strength to overcome. He trusted in God's promises. He trusted, and we need to learn to trust. If we're afraid of things, we need to trust because of God, of what God has said He'll do for us. What we talked about in the sermon this morning. When we're facing giants, when we're facing things that are His, remember God said He would be faithful in those. And the best thing to do when you're dealing with fear and anxiety and worry is to live the today. Because most fear and most anxiety is about what if tomorrow. So He says, ground yourself today. Count your blessings today. And we're not going to get through tonight, but we'll stop. We're just going to, okay? Hurt, sadness, and loneliness. You ever been hurt by somebody? Have you ever felt alone? Okay. So hurt. Hurt is a feeling of pain, sadness, or unhappiness caused by someone's words, actions, or neglect. Hurt comes when someone does something that goes into your heart and creates this feeling that you are not loved or appreciated. And there's two extremes. There's hurt feelings, and there's deep heart hurt. Okay? That's on the scale from one to the other. What does that look like? Well, a hurt feeling can be as simple or as quick and painful as someone said something or did something, and we take it to be something it wasn't. When my wife said something, I took it and made it she was attacking me, which made me hurt. But on the other end, you got a deeper hurt or associated with loss or with an abandonment or profound issues that we haven't ever dealt with. Right? And that's where we come into play in some of that. That's where hurt becomes a part of life. Right? That's where hurt becomes who we are and what we deal with in that process. Key strategies. When you're dealing with hurt, when you're dealing with someone who hurts you, or dealing with someone who creates a hurt in you, let me put it the way it's supposed to be said. Well, acknowledge your process. Acknowledge you're dealing with it. Acknowledge what you're going through. Acknowledge the fact that you're hurt. Practice self-care. Now, if you truly have been scarred and you have somebody's really hurt you, then take the precautions you need to protect yourself. Okay? Take the precautions you need to give yourself the space to deal with that. But reframe your perspective. Change the way you think about it. Did they intentionally search out to hurt you? Okay? Because if you can change your perspective, you can shift what that emotion looks like or the gravity of that emotion. Choose forgiveness. And we'll talk about this some more tomorrow. Choose forgiveness. Choose to release them from that. Because as long as you hold on to it, the hurt still exists. You ever taken an ice cube and put it in your hand and hold on to it and it just gets hurt? It's just more and more painful, but the more you hold on to it, the more it hurts. How do you get rid of that hurt in your hand? Let go of the ice cube. But we think and we live the emotion of hurt and we just hold on to that hurt. And we hold on to that hurt, and the tighter we hold on to that hurt, the more painful it gets. And the more painful it gets, and the only way to truly let go, or the only truly way to save ourselves from that pain, is to let go. And if you need to, seek professional help. Peter says, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but on the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Let go of the hurt and bless those who are in need of it. And we'll finish with these 4 healthy responses. If you want to deal with your hurt, you want to deal with what's going on in your life that's hurting you so much, step aside and don't take it personal. Avoid trying to retaliate for the hurt that was caused you. Focus on today, not what happened 10 years ago, not what happened 5 years ago, not what happened yesterday, but focus on today and try to reconnect with joy and happiness in that process. Because the longer you learn to dwell, or the longer you dwell on the hurt, the more distant you are from joy. But the more you can take on the joy, the less the hurt has its effect in your life. So God calls us to live with joy. And we'll stop there. We'll pick up tomorrow. Tomorrow night, we're going to look at some longer driven emotions. We'll hit a couple of these before we go in, but we'll look at those longer emotions and how do we deal with things like resentment and other things like that. But thank you for listening. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow.